Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a great crowd. It's an intimidating crowd. I know you're all gardeners. And so, you're going to look at me askance and think, well, what is he really going to try to tell me today that I don't already know? So please be kind. Be kind. Okay? I'm not young. Nice to be here on this lovely sort of late winter, early spring day. We have no idea what the weather's doing, do we? I'm going to take questions at the end, so if you can just sort of make some notes on your sheets or in your mind, I will answer the questions after I'm through speaking. So, when I was approached to give a talk, I said that I do talk on several different topics, and the one that was selected was ground covers for the Northeast. And as you were just told, I retired from Mount Cuba Center in Delaware, which is devoted entirely to native plants and native plant gardening. Has anybody been to the garden?
I've been there.
Yes, it's beautiful. Yes. And so that's why I became very involved in native plants. I have a large history behind me on non-natives. Ornamental horticulture has been my bag for like 45 years. And so ending my career on the native plant note was very, very important to me, because now, as an advocate of native plant gardening, I have been able to integrate a lot of native plants into what I talk about to garden clubs or to other organizations. So part of what I'm talking about today is native plants, and part of what I'm talking about today are not native plants. So I will, without further ado, I will just get going. So we have an agenda. I taught for 40 years. What makes a good ground cover? Ground covers to avoid, which I'm sure you're all interested in knowing. And then we're going to talk about a variety of shade-loving ground covers and sun-loving ground covers, because I know that some of you garden in sun, some of you garden in shade, and some of you garden in both. So I'm trying to include plants that are going to satisfy a broad audience. So what makes a good ground cover? Well, you think of ground covers, I'm sure, as short plants that spread, that they sucker, that they cover the ground. And generally, that's what people first think about when they say, ground covers. These kinds of spreading and suckering plants are great for large-scale landscaping, okay? You can use them in a smaller landscape, like a home landscape, but I'm separating my talk today sort of between these kinds of spreaders, like northern barren strawberry. This is a spreading ground cover that will cover up to 10 to 15 square feet of property in 3 to 5 years. So this kind of ground cover is suckering and spreading. Then there are compact clump-forming plants. And you're going to say, well, Duncan, clump-forming plants are not my idea of a ground cover. And I'm going to try to get you away from that thought process, because these kind of clump-forming plants can be used in smaller scale, smaller settings. And if you plant them closely enough together, they will end up looking like a nice patch of territory, like this plantain leaf sedge. And this is not a spreading, suckering plant. This is a clump-forming plant. And I think that it looks very, very nice here. It's not designed for 40 by 40 square foot properties, but it's definitely designed for smaller, more intimate-sized landscapes. Ground cover should be relatively long-lived, so we're not talking about annuals. It should have the ability to eliminate or at least compete with weeds. And I think that's a very important part of gardening. Weeding is a very big part of gardening, isn't it? Yes. Yes, exactly. And that's what keeps you agile and young. Exactly, see? It's not all bad with weeds. And they should tolerate a relatively wide range of soil conditions, because not all of us have perfect soil. Now, sometimes I'll talk about the kinds of soils the plants require, and that's kind of important to know. But I think that a good ground cover will be very adaptable to soil conditions. So let's talk about turf. This is a ground cover. You all know turf. And turf spreads. It's long-lived. It has the ability to eliminate weeds, or at least compete with weeds for the most part, and the ability to tolerate a wide range of soils, which is great, which is why it's so commonly used in the landscape. But a good ground cover should provide ecosystem services. And I think this is becoming more important to us. Does lawn support ecosystem services? Not particularly, no. And when I talk about ecosystem services, I'm talking about pollinators for the most part. And a lot of the turf does not really have a flowering component to it that is going to engage a lot of our pollinators. So ecosystem services, I think, are part of a good ground cover plant. And they should be attractive, right? Of course they should be attractive. That's nice. That looks nice. Ground covers. That looks nice. This one particularly shows a lot of ground covers that are short and tall, okay? So some of the ground covers in this picture are grasses that get fairly tall. And this I put in here because this is a very small scale landscape. And a woman in New Jersey sent me this picture. This is from her front yard. And she had taken a class with me, I think at Mount Cuba. And she rushed back home and she said, Duncan, this is my little ground cover garden at the entrance to her house. And I said, this is a great example to show people, because you probably think, oh, my ground covers have to be taking up 10 by 10 or 20 by 20 square foot areas. No, they don't. You can put these ground covers together in these little combinations that work well for your particular site. So it's just a little list of, this is from the real world. This woman actually sent me this, and she's very proud of it. And you notice, and they're not all native plants. Some of them are native, some of them are not native. And she has a container in the middle of it that is, of course, just for an annual display. So you can do this at home too. So I didn't want to intimidate you with the idea that you have to have these big swaths of ground covers. You can do a nice little intimate ground cover planting like this. And of course, it's always good to mix things up. You don't want to have just one kind of foliage texture, big and bold. You want to have different foliage textures. You want to have different foliage colors. And you want to have different heights to these ground covers. So when you put your ground cover combinations together, you want to consider color, height, flower color, foliage color, and all sorts of things like that. But the most important thing you have to think about when you put your little ground cover patch together is, can they grow in the same conditions? Okay? And so it's worth your while to kind of do a little bit of exploratory research on, I want to put these 4 ground covers together. Are they going to do well in this situation? Full sun, part shade, part sun. So always good to do a little bit of background research. Do not plant these ground covers. And I'm not going to ask you who is guilty. We're not planting vinca. I know. I loved vinca. We're not supposed to anymore. If you have it, don't rip it out, just ignore it. We are not planting yellow archangel, ever. We're not planting English ivy, again, ever. We're not planting Bishop's goutweed at all. I have tried to get rid of that plant over 40 years and it still persists, terrible. I'm not a fan of that. So try to avoid, don't buy these, don't plant these, and try to dig them out, try to get rid of them, try to do your best to not recommend them to people, to say, what can I plant? Try to plant something that's not these particular culprits. And definitely not Hall's honeysuckle. Hall's honeysuckle is my least favorite invasive plant. It is a ground cover. Do y'all know Hall's honeysuckle? Hall's honeysuckle is a ground cover, and then it hits a wall or a fence, and it scrambles up the fence, and then it's a vine, and then it becomes a full-fledged shrub. So we're not planting this, okay? I'm glad to hear you're not planting this. It's hard to get rid of, too. It's a nightmare. So here are the plants that we're going to look at today. They're on your list. We're going to look at wild ginger, European ginger, green and gold, which is a new plant to you probably, sweet woodruff, which may not be a new plant to you. We have foam flower, tiarella, great plant, barren wort, which again, some of you may already know, ferns. We'll talk about a couple of ferns because ferns make good ground covers as well. And I'm going to talk about 2 sedges, Pennsylvania sedge and plantain leaf sedge. And Mount Cuba Center just published a report on sedges. So if anyone is interested in sedges, this report from Mount Cuba Center is really going to give you all the information you need on what sedges to plant where. Okay? So I'm going to talk about a couple of sedges. And then for sunny locations, I'm talking about candy tuft, Iberus, catmint, moss phlox, which some of you may know, and lamb's ear. So these may not be new plants to you, but I wanted to just kind of bring them to the table because we have shade, we have sun, we have a variety of options. This is a great plant, Canada wild ginger. This is native to North America, native to our region here. And you see in the slide that it's an ideal plant to grow alongside ferns. So right off the bat, you're able to see, oh, I can plant this plant with ferns. As long as the ferns do not run over the the Canada wild ginger, okay? Because some ferns are going to run over it, some ferns will remain nice, play nice. It's a deciduous plant, so what you see here will disappear at the end of the season. It slowly spreads by rhizomes. It's not a fast spreader. And you see this is a large clump of it here. This has taken a few years, 5 to 7 years plus, for this plant to spread. Okay, so it's not a real fast spreader. It's only short, 6 to 8 inches. It spreads about 1 to 2 feet. Each plant over a 1 to 2 foot space over a number of years, slowly. Part shade to full shade, which is great. The soil should be relatively good quality soil, like foresty kinds of soil, like soil that has organic matter in it. And just looking at the slide here, you can tell, yeah, that's at the base of a tree. It looks like it's in a bed that was created, and it looks like the soil here should be kind of leaf moldy, humusy, organic-y. All right? So this does require some soil that is going to be relatively moisture holding. Okay? Oh. Deer resistant. Now I've got you, see? Now I've got hold of you, deer resistant. This is a weird little plant because the flowers are beneath the foliage, and the flowers are kind of this purpley, brownish, beigey color, and the flowers lie on the ground, as you see in the photo. And the thing about the flowers is that we don't see them, and yet what does see them and find them are beetles and flies and ants. And the reason that beetles in particular and flies can find this plant is it's a foul-smelling flower. Foul-smelling. But we don't see it, we don't smell it, we're not lying on the ground, doing that. And so they kind of find these flowers to pollinate them. So again, beetles, flies, and ants will help to pollinate this plant. These are a couple of ideas that I'm giving you about where to plant it with. You can plant it with sweet woodruff. So sweet woodruff is a nice combination to plant with this because the foliage texture is different, and you see the white flowers of sweet woodruff on the left. On the right-hand side is a plant called wild geranium, which takes semi-shaded conditions, and it stands above the foliage of the ginger, and it's not an aggressive spreader. Both of them are relatively slow spreaders. And the ferns in the background. So this is the kind of plant that will go well with a variety of different plants as long as they're not aggressive and are going to swamp the ginger. It goes nicely with sedges, as you see in the background, and that's one of the narrow-leafed sedges. They look like grasses. They're not grasses, but they look like grasses. And so again, we're talking about foliage texture, very thin arching foliage next to the beefier, more robust foliage of the ginger. Its cousin is the European ginger, and I'm sure that some of you know this plant already. There it is. It's right there in the same slide I showed you earlier. It's a very popular ground cover, and some notes on it. You can tell it is not the same as our native ginger. The foliage on the right is the European. The one on the left is our native. The native one has fuzzy, kind of medium green, almost smoky green color. And the European one has very glossy green leaves that are relatively small, like, I don't know, that big around. It's an evergreen plant, unlike its North American cousin. Again, 6 inches, it spreads to about 1 or 2 feet. It is extremely slow, extremely slow to spread. It makes the native one look like it's like, racing around by comparison. This is a gem of a plant, but it's a very slow plant to spread. And again, the same kind of soil conditions. So they like the same light, they like the same soil. This is very slow to spread, very slow to spread. It really does well in shade, like really shade-loving plant. The foliage is what gives it its interest. It's leathery, it's glossy. There are no serious pests, it's deer resistant. And the only thing that I can say about it is that it's very slow to spread. So you want this in a relatively this is a small space ground cover. And you see here in the original slide, it's working amongst other plants like the Japanese painted fern, the Hakanakloa grass. Oh, I think I've labeled them here. Oh, heuchera, it goes well with heuchera. And there's the Hakanakloa grass, the hostas, the Japanese painted fern, and coral bells. So, this is the same light requirements as those plants. And all the plants you see there, the Hackanachoa grass will get fairly large and maybe too big for what you would want it to do. But the other plants, I think if you get the right size of hosta, it'll complement the wild ginger very nicely. So again, putting plants together in textures and colors that may be nice. Green and gold, Chrysogonum virginianum, is, again, it's a plant of the northeastern United States, and it stretches from where we are here down to Virginia and the Carolinas. And this is what you get. This is a picture of it at Mount Cuba Center. And it's a spreading plant. It is a ground cover. It does spread. And this is what you're growing it for. You're growing it for the fact that it's a semi-evergreen. It's slow to spread by rhizomes, which are underground stems. Again, short, so these are fitting into our short 6 to 8 inch high ground cover picture of what we think a ground cover to be. And it spreads about 18 inches. So if you're planting these plants, and you can get them as plugs, which I heard earlier, you can get them as plugs and plug them into the ground. I would probably plant them at maybe 6 to 8 inch distances apart. Because 8-inch distances apart on a plug, which is like 2.5-inch deep little roots. I think that over a couple of years that will knit in quite nicely together for you. Partial shade or dappled sun. So dappled sun is basically if you have like a Japanese maple tree with high branches and the sun kind of comes down through it, that is dappled sun. So it would be great in partial sun to a degree of partial shade. Well-drained soil with organic matter. So these kinds of plants, again, are going to be used in a smaller landscape setting with relatively good quality soil. I think it's very important for you to get your soil right before you start planting plants, if you can. It has beautiful yellow flowers, bright yellow flowers in midsummer, and bees and butterflies are pollinators, so you'll have them come to your garden. There are no serious insect problems. It's deer resistant, and it's very, very, very low maintenance. The only thing that you might have to do is do some weeding. And perennial weeds are, of course, a problem. So you kind of have to get out there and get the perennial weeds out. But that will cover the ground in this dense carpet of green foliage for the remainder of the season. So an even green ground cover. There it is with aucuba at the top. So there it is underneath aucuba, which is an evergreen shrub. And below there, again, sedges go well with this plant. Sedges will take the same kinds of conditions, partial shade, partial sun. They give a finer texture look to it. And they'll go well with foam flower, which is the tiarellas. Okay? Tiarellas are not aggressive, and the green and gold is not aggressive. So they can kind of live side by side with one another. I've known sweet woodruff for a long, long time. I lived in Alberta, Canada for 20-some years, and that is hardiness zone 2. I know. And so you're all thinking, we're in zone 5. It's like you're living in Florida by comparison to Alberta. And I had this plant on the north side of my house in Alberta. And this is a shade-loving plant. And it grew up there, so it's very hardy, very, very tough, durable plant. And you're seeing here that it's growing again with some well-behaved ferns, and it's sort of covering the base of the ground around this multi-stem tree. It's rhizomatous, spreads by underground stems. 6 to 8 inches tall. In flower, it's about 8 inches. In foliage, about 6 inches. And they'll spread to 12 to 18 inches, part shade to full shade, in any well-drained soil. This is not a fussy plant, as long as the soil drains well. And that's very important for you as gardeners, and you already know this, that the soil has to drain well. Boggy soils only support a very few kinds of plants. So this wants well-drained soil. Doesn't really care what the soil is per se, just as long as it drains well. And this is not a really rapid spreader either. It's kind of a slow to spread plant, okay? It flowers in midsummer or early summer, and the flowers are fragrant. They're very bright, very white, and they're fragrant. And they have this kind of weird, sweet, nutty vanilla flavor, but do not eat it because, of course, they can have a blood-thinning effect if eaten in large amounts. So don't eat them, okay? Pardon?
Eat the pansies.
Eat the pansies, exactly. Eat the violets, the pansies, but not the sweet woodruff, okay? I didn't research this, but if any of you have pets, you might want to kind of look and see if the pets shouldn't eat this at all either, okay? So just make a note, is this okay with pets? Because sometimes people ask me that. The foliage is beautiful, and it's sort of like wrapped around the stem, which is gorgeous, like dark green leaves, no special care, no serious pest problems, and deer resistant. So the plants we're looking at so far are relatively easy to grow in partial shade with okay-ish soil, organic soil for some of them. They're deer resistant and pest free, which is really good to know. So here's a whole sweep of it underneath a tree. And again, it's the kind of plant that you can get plugs of. You can get plugs of and plant them in to make it sort of a dense fabric that you see here. And this is a picture I took in someplace in Vermont, I believe, this past summer. And it's growing with hostas, which you see here, a little hosta. It's growing with sweet woodruff. It is sweet woodruff. And lily of the valley. And then the other purple flowered plant is like a spotted dead nettle. And that is not the weedy one, it's sort of the ornamental one for the garden. So these, again, are partial shade plants, all right? So again, lily of the valley, sweet woodruff, hosta, and so it's working well with that combination. And you see the foliage textures are kind of neat and different. And tiarella, we were talking about this earlier. This is foam flower. How many of you are growing foam flower? Yay, well, why don't you tell me about it? No, I know. Again, we're back at Mount Cuba Center, and this is one of the pathways at Mount Cuba Center, and this is in sort of late spring. And there are rhododendrons. You can see how dense it is with the trees and shrubs on the right. But you see where the central pathway is, there's light coming to the ground. So this isn't growing in dense shade, this is growing in filtered light or partial light. So when you see a slide like this, you can say to yourself, oh, okay, it's not going to grow way underneath those pine trees. It's not going to grow way out underneath those rhododendrons. It's going to grow, it's going to find its way to where the light is. And that's the nice thing about this plant, or many plants, that if you plant them in a situation that's okay in your mind, they may say, no, I'd rather move over here, where it's better for them to live, as long as they don't die ahead of time. So anyway, so this is kind of what this slide is showing you. They like to be at the edge of a path where you can enjoy them, you can see them, and you can engage with them as sort of the human scale. They're short plants. The flowers come up to 8 to 10 inches. The foliage comes up to about, 8 inches. It spreads by stolons, which are above ground stems like strawberries, spreads like that. They have white or pale pink flowers in May, which is spring, and partial shade, and slightly moist organic soil. So again, that's a good thing to note. Don't just pop it into bad soil, pop it into soil you've amended with organic matter. And it's basically a low maintenance plant. And I was talking with, was it Jane, I think, earlier? And she had gotten some that had already spread in her yard. She got little plugs of them, and 3 years later, it's starting to make a nice carpet. So a great plant for these semi-shade conditions. The foliage is attractive, the flowers are attractive, and nothing really harms the foliage. No bugs or other insects are going to eat the foliage. It flowers at the same time of year as trilliums, and the flowers come well above the foliage. And here's a combo of ferns, sedges, which are the little grassy things, columbines, the little, there's one little red columbine flower at the very bottom of there. See, I know, see? I was waiting for you to find it. And that's Jack in the Pulpit in the back, which is an interesting plant as well. So here's kind of a use of this as a ground cover working amongst the sedges. So sedges and the foam flower kind of work nicely together. The nice thing about foam flower is that it has foliage that they've bred, they've selected. They've selected plants with foliage that has unique qualities and characteristics and colors. This is mint chocolate, a beautiful plant. And so when it's out of flower, the foliage looks neat. So you have kind of a multi-season effect here. Spring, the beautiful flowers, and then summer into fall, you have the foliage, which is different than just the species has just plain green foliage. Okay? Barrenwort. This is at Wave Hill, and this I took this past fall. I was there in the fall, and I said, I'm teaching ground covers, and here's barrenwort. And barrenwort is a plant that's been around in the landscape industry for many, many, many decades, and I'm sure some of you have barrenwort in your yards. And the reason I selected it is because it takes really tough conditions. And that's kind of good for you who have tough conditions to plant a plant in. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But here's a whole sweep of it along the pathway at Wave Hill. It's a deciduous plant, so the foliage disappears. 6 inches high, 12 inches spread. Each plant will spread about 2 feet slowly. It is not a rapid spreader, slowly. If you give it relatively good soil, it will spread more quickly. But if you put it in, oftentimes I've seen it planted underneath trees. And tree roots are at the surface and the soil's kind of scrappy, and people will plant this plant there because it'll take that kind of competitive situation where it's dry soil because the tree roots are taking up the moisture, and this will establish itself in and survive. So it's not very fast to spread in average soil, but it's okay to spread in a little bit better soil. So the foliage is quite different. You can get a lot of different cultivars of this plant. They have different foliage shapes and sizes. So when you go to the garden centers or you look at this plant online, you'll see you have a whole wide range of foliage textures and sizes to look at. Many of them have good fall color. And I think that's one of the advantages of this plant, is that if you get the right selection, the right cultivar, it can have nice red fall foliage color. So it's an added bonus to the flowers. The flowers rise above the foliage. The flowers are very delicate and they're dainty, and you can see them quite nicely because the foliage is kind of the backdrop for these plants and for these flowers. And the flowers come in whites and yellows and bicolors and lavenders and rose. So you have a wide range of opportunities here for your garden and for your particular desires, color-wise. And they're sort of an early summer flowering plant, okay? So this, I think, is one of their primary advantages, if you can get one that has reddish fall color. Some of them, and if you, again, research this plant, some of them even have reddish colored foliage in the spring. So some of them will come out with reddish foliage, go to green, and then come back to red in the fall. So there's a lot of interesting versatility. And, okay, divide it in late summer after it's flowered, one of the little tips for gardeners. It's great in dry shade. And people say, what can I grow in dry shade? And that's the situation I described earlier. A tree with you can plant it amongst, sort of underneath a tree as a carpet, and that is dry shade. And this is a good plant for that, because not a lot of the ground covers I've spoken about so far are going to be very good in dry conditions, okay? When you think of shade, you think of moist, cool, but there are situations in shade where it can be dry, and this is a good plant for dry shade. I'm going to talk about just a couple of ferns here. One is a brute and one is a friend. I know. This is the friend, ostrich fern. And ostrich fern is a great plant. It's big and bold, and it's very much in your face as far as ferns go. It gets 4 feet tall. So it gets way up there. So it's a tall plant that you'll want to put at the back of the garden if you want. Okay, so probably at the back of your garden. It's the plant itself spreads about 3 feet. It has a V shape when the fronds come up. It has the letter V shape to the plant when it comes up, and it maintains that V shape throughout the remainder of the season. Moist yet well-drained soil. So again, this is a fern that really prefers a moist kind of cool, moist shade. Cool, moist shade. Space them about 3 apart for coverage in 3 years, 3 feet apart. So you can buy them in 1-gallon pots, and you plant them about 2 to 3 feet apart, and they'll start to grow up and mesh together, and then slowly spread around the place. And ferns in general are rabbit and deer proof, which is great. It's a great plant for shaded woodlands. So if you have I think even more importantly, if any of you have a water feature that's in the shade or you have a stream running through your property, this is a great plant for the water's edge. It has the moisture from the soil. It has kind of the coolness of the semi-shade from the trees or shrubs that are above the stream or the water feature. And it will really settle in quite nicely there and make a very nice, dense ground cover for that location. So cool, moist shade along waterways. You can grow them as a cluster at the back of your border where it's shadier. So you know how many borders have the front, which is like the Tiarella slide I showed you, which is sunny near the edge, and then it starts getting shadier as you get back into the border. This is perfect for the back of your border as a ground cover for a shaded spot behind the shorter plants. This is the brute, hay-scented fern. And hay-scented fern, anybody know this plant? Oh dear, I know. Oh, really? So you already know that this is a really aggressive spreader. It's rhizomatous and it can spread. You plant it and it'll spread. It's a 2.5-foot tall plant by 3 feet. I mean, it spreads to 3 feet, it spreads forever. Partial shade to full shade. I mean, the good news is that it's in full shade, and we'll get to where you can plant it shortly. It is adapted to a wide range of soils. It's very drought tolerant once it's established. And so it has, unlike the ostrich fern, this is a dry shade fern, But you have to keep it corralled, okay? If you have a site like this, which is bounded, this is a walkway bounded by asphalt, and the center patch is corralled. So it's not going to spread out into another part of the garden, because this is where it spreads. It spreads quite quickly. It has beautiful yellow fall foliage color, which I think we can all agree is attractive. Again, no pest problems and deer and rabbit resistant, like all the ferns are. So, where are we going to plant it? If you have woodlands, that are at the back of your property or beyond your landscape, your more formal residential landscape, plant it out in the woodlands where it'll just be able to spread on its own in full shade and just do its thing. At Mount Cuba Center, they planted it in a beautiful native herbaceous plant border. And when I started there, the fern was kind of like nice and lovely, and 7 years later, the herbaceous plants were gone. And I thought, what were they thinking? This is Mount Cuba Center. I mean, of course they were thinking. They just learned. There you go. Anyway, so it's going to really eat up the landscape. I'm throwing in 2 sedges, and sedges are very popular now. They're very interesting. They're useful plants for us in the landscape, and I'm talking about 2, Pennsylvania sedge and plantain leaf sedge. And you can tell they're very different. One is thin, grass-like foliage. The other one is a beefier, more broader leaf textured plant. So the first one is Pennsylvania sedge. It's a clump forming and slowly spreads. So if you get little plugs of this, which I highly recommend you get plugs of this, then you plant them, I don't know, about 8 inches apart or so, and then they'll knit together, and then they'll slowly spread to become a carpet of green, grassy-like foliage. They're about 1 foot high, and then the foliage comes up and flops over, and they spread about 1.5 feet per plant, okay? Semi-shaded sites, not dense shade, and not full sun. So we're now moving into the half sun, half shade plants. And they have beautiful grass-like foliage. It's not fussy on soil, which is great. Well-drained is important. Somewhat drought tolerant once it's established. It's deer resistant. And you see in the slide here that the walkway goes through these plants. This is not going to be a plant you can walk on like a lawn. It's not going to be a lawn grass. It's going to be an ornamental sedge so that you can plant it to look like a lawn. It can look like a lawn if you wish, but it's not the kind of lawn you can walk on and sit on and play on, all right? But the grass-like foliage makes it look like a grassy plant, which it is. So it's a great plant for small landscape settings, okay? I would use it in relatively small areas that are semi-shade and have well-drained soil. Its cousin, the plantain leaf sedge, is a clump-forming plant, as I mentioned earlier. It's about 1 foot tall by maybe 1 foot wide, and I would space them 8 inches apart if I was planting them in the garden, all right? It has these broad, wrinkled leaves. It's called seersucker sedge as well. I know. I'm of the generation which knows what seersucker was. And the leaves, if you look closely at the plant on the right, it's got these little pucker things, which it should be called seer pucker instead of seersucker. But anyway, so it has that kind of puckery kind of leaf to it. So anyway, it has these neat leaves, and it's in partial sun, partial shade, well-drained soils with organic matter. This likes a little bit better soil, and deer resistant. So I think all the plants we've spoken about so far are deer resistant. And this is a use of it at Mount Cuba Center. This is a patio, and this is the plant. This is the plantain leaf sedge underneath this small tree. And this is south-facing. This is south-facing. But the wall on the left shows you that it casts some shadow. And so it takes sun, not full-on beating sun. On the left of the wall would be beating sun. This is more of partial sun with some shade, okay? But you can see it looks like it's a nice ground cover. That's about 8 feet wide by about 15 feet long, okay? So 8 feet by 15 feet is what you're looking at here. And you can use that in a similar capacity in your property. And here's the slide that I showed you earlier, perhaps, where it's knitted together and looks like a nice ground cover. At the end of the season, people say, how do I treat this plant? I would let all the foliage die and leave it in place. And then if you want to clean it up in the spring, go right ahead. I just like to leave it there and have new foliage come up through it because I'm a very low-key gardener. Okay, we have a few sun-loving plants for those of you who have sun in your property. Candy tuft is not a new plant to you. It's a really old-fashioned plant, and probably one of those plants that was in favor in the 40s and 50s and out of favor and back and forth. But it's a very tough, durable plant, very tough and durable. And it has this wonderful, wonderful bright white flowers in the early summer. So it's an evergreen, which is great. It's a clump, it slowly spreads around. It's not a fast spreader, so you have to plant several of them kind of together. And it says it's a relatively fast, well, anyway, it depends on the soil. 12 inches tall by about 18 inches wide. They form these little cushions, which is nice. Average soil that is well drained and very drought tolerant. And I showed you this, I'm showing you this slide because this is from where it is native to in Turkey. So it's native to Turkey, and what you see on the right-hand side is the plant tucked in amongst rocks. So this tells you I can use it in a rock garden. That's a rock garden plant, which is nice. And so here it is in its native landscape, full-on beating sun. It's on a slope, so the water is draining away. It's not sitting in boggy soil. And the soil's probably just average run-of-the-mill soil. So nice to show you what these plants look like in their native location. They root where they touch the ground, so they very slowly spread around the garden, which is nice. And they have beautiful flowers in springtime bloom. And they have these very unattractive seed heads that come on later on. I know, but what are we doing with unattractive seed heads? We're pruning them off because we like to get some activity, exercise in spring. But yeah, it's kind of the one drawback I have of this plant is that it has these seed heads that are kind of unattractive. Hey, but leave them there and they'll spread themselves around and make new little plantlets. There's pink varieties of this as well, if you like pink. So there are pink varieties of this plant too. Evergreen foliage, glossy green foliage, very attractive. And if you're going to grow it, I have recommended to people, after it flowers and those seed heads are starting to come on, I've been known to go out in the garden and cut it by a third. Just cut it all back, like by a third, after the flowers are done. And then, you know, it keeps the habit more compact, and then the seed heads are gone. So you can shear it a little bit to make it look more attractive for the remainder of the season. Deer and rabbit proof. Catmint. I know. It's disappointed that it's not catnip. That's why the cat's giving you a fairly unattractive look. You say, I heard catmint. Well, it's not catnip, dear. Anyway, this is a great plant, and I think this is one of my favorite plants because it's indestructible. This is a full sun plant. 10 to 24 inches tall. They can get a little bit billowy. Spread to 1 to 2 feet, so you're getting good value for your money. Well-drained, full sun locations. Shear it after it flowers, like I mentioned with the previous plant, the candy tuft. So if it gets a little bit, you know, over the top, just go out there and shear it all back. Just prune it back, and it'll fill out quite nicely after that. Beautiful pale blue, purplish flowers, lilac-colored flowers, and they can bloom from late spring into summer. They have beautiful fuzzy, fuzzy, fuzzy foliage. Anybody ever touch the foliage? How many of you like the smell of it? Oh, and I won't say what I was going to say. I've never really found the smell of this particular foliage attractive to Duncan, to me, but that's just me. But beautiful foliage, it's beautiful foliage. Here it is coming up in the spring. It has this kind of like moundy form, this beautiful roundy, moundy form. It's very well behaved in the spring. At the end of the season, you cut it down. It comes up in the spring. It's very, very easy. It's like a no-fuss plant. Here it is at the front of a border. So here it is growing right next to the sidewalk. It's spilling over the sidewalk and has beautiful, beautiful, these lavender purple flowers. And you can tell it's a relatively tall plant, all right? And so that is what it does. And once the flowers are done, you can prune it back and have more foliage for the remainder of the season. I took this at Scarsdale shopping mall where they put in the new Saks or whatever that's, is it Saks? Anyway, truth be told, I stopped the car and I said, that is one of those parking lot triangles where they plant plants that have to be tough. And so this is it here. It's not a very good slide, my apologies, but that is cat mint in this full-on, hot, dry, middle of a parking lot, right there. It's like, and it's living, and it looks good. It's like, and no one's looking, who's looking after this plant? No one, no one. So good on it, right? So it's like a low-maintenance plant for you when you have a beautiful, sunny location. This is moss phlox, and this will come into bloom in the next several weeks, I hope, probably end of April. And what are we in, March? Maybe the 1st of April, who knows? And this is moss phlox, and you all probably know this plant. It's a common garden plant. It's a common rock garden plant, and this is it growing in the wild. And again, it's kind of neat to see it where it grows natively because that tells us something about where we can grow it in the garden. And it looks like it's growing in a part of the woodland that is full on sun. It looks like this part of the woodland had the upper story removed and it's growing in sun, and it's kind of growing in amongst those grassy plants and holding its own, which I'm kind of surprised to see because normally we plant it by itself. We don't plant it with other plants generally. So this is it in the wild. Evergreen plant, mat forming, a little carpet as you see here, and dry, rocky, sandy soils, and good drainage is mandatory. So this has to be in a well-drained soil, well-drained soil. It's only 6 inches tall, spreads to about 2 feet. This foliage is small and needle-like and prickly. It blooms April, May-ish, probably April, late April here. The flowers are very showy and fragrant and deer-resistant. The plant's deer-resistant. So again, I think that the majority of plants that we've seen are deer-proof today. The nice thing about this plant is that it has a lot of different flower colors. You're not just stuck with pink or white. It has lavenders, blues, it has rose colors, it has bicolors. So you have a wide range of color choices with our moss phlox. And that, I think, is good for us because it gives us opportunity to jazz the garden up a little bit with all these wonderful flower colors. In the spring, it's a magnet for swallowtail butterflies. Day-flying sphinx moths, okay, so sphinx moths, and occasionally hummingbirds, okay? And hummingbirds see red, shades of red and blue, which I think most people don't know, but they'll see blue as well as pinks and reds. So it's an early season source of nectar for a variety of different plants. Here it is used as a ground cover. Again, we're not talking about, this is the lawn, is the major ground cover here, and this is a patch of moss phlox here, a rock garden plant, and on the right-hand side is a sidewalk in Mamaroneck that I took that picture on, and this is a rock wall. There's a chain link fence, and then that is a rock wall. It's in full bright sun, and the moss phlox is living on top of the rock wall. And no one's looking after this plant. It is just growing there, and it's perfectly happy. Full sun, there's only a little bit of soil on the top of that wall, not a lot. And it's growing there, and it's just having a great time, a great time. The one thing about this plant that I didn't show you is that when it's out of flower, you can shear it back a little bit. So once the flowers are done, you can just shear it back a little bit, and that'll make it a little more dense, okay? A little, maintenance tip. Lamb's ear, I love lamb's ears. I love lamb's ears. When I first encountered them a number of years ago, I thought this is a great plant. It's a Mediterranean plant, full-on sun, well-drained soil. It integrates so well with a lot of other different plants. The alliums here, the tall purple flowered plants, are coming up through it, which is kind of nice. So it's not a thuggish plant. It's kind of a slow-to-spread plant. It's clump forming and slowly spreads. Again, shot of it this past fall, October 28th at Wave Hill as an edging plant. It's an edging plant, as you see here. It's a shortish plant. 6 to 12 inches tall, average well-drained soil. You can divide it and move it around quite easily. And I think that's something to be aware. This plant can be a little bit, well, it's beautiful. The foliage is great, the color is great, the texture is great. Visually, it's stunning, it's eye-catching. Your eyes are drawn to it because it's white, reflective. And it has these tall flower spikes. And that was the kind of thing that kind of made me think, I'm over this plant. I shouldn't say these things in public. We all love this plant. But they're beautiful when they're in flower. The flower spikes have these silvery leaves as well. They have these little purplish, pinkish flowers, and they kind of look nice for a bit of time. But you really should get out there and cut them down after they're done flowering because they aren't attractive. After this point in time, they're not pretty. So I would just collect them all, just go and cut them down, and then you're back to square one where the foliage looks fairly nice. So the only drawback to this plant, I would say, is that these tall, very attractive spikes of flowers need to be cut back, and then you kind of just have the foliage, the original look of the plant back with you, okay? It can self-sow, which is nice. We like free plants. And yeah, so I think just pruning back those flower spikes is the way to go. There's a cultivar called Helen von Stein. Helen von Stein is a non-flowering version of this. There are a couple of non-flowering versions of Stachys, a couple of non-flowering cultivars. And this is one of them. And all you get is the foliage. So you're not going to get the flowering spikes on them. And, you know, so it's a little less maintenance in the garden. And as I said, those look good for a while, but after a while they start looking a little bit unattractive, those flower spikes. So here's a cultivar that you can get. And look in the garden centers or look online and say, these are 2 cultivars or 3 cultivars of lamb's ear that are not flowering. And I think that I think to me is good. You know, I mean, a little less gardening is okay with me as well. Okay? Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. I hope you've learned something today, and I hope you have some questions for me.